Rates on 30-year mortgages fell this week after federal officials took over troubled mortgage giants Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and that was part of the plan. Last week's bailout put Fannie and Freddie into conservatorship, which the government will run temporarily. In addition, the U.S. Treasury will buy mortgage-backed securities owned by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The goal is to get Fannie and Freddie some much-needed cash. The government may also loan the two mortgage giants up to $200 billion in capital if needed. That's your money, that's my money, that's taxpayer money. Together, Fannie and Freddie own or guarantee more than 1/2 of all U.S. mortgages, valued at about $5 trillion. So let's find out if this was a good move. I'm joined by Peter Schiff, president of Euro Pacific Capital, and Dan Gross, senior editor at Newsweek. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Peter, you think this was a blunder of colossal proportions.
It was a terrible idea. It's another example of the government cure being worse than the government disease. No, it was the government that created the housing bubble. It was both the actions of the Federal Reserve and Fannie and Freddie. And now that Fannie and Freddie have gone bankrupt, which is something that I actually have been predicting for years, the government should have taken the opportunity to simply allow them to fail and to tell all the holders around the world and the United States of $5.5 trillion of mortgages guaranteed by Freddie and Fannie that they're on their own.
But Dan, allowing them to fail would have been worse for the housing market and the U.S. economy?
Well, not just for the U.S. economy and the housing market, but for our international reputation. For years, we have been telling people, our central bankers, when they go to Davos, when they go to the G8 and they're rubbing shoulders with their counterparts in China and the Persian Gulf, we've effectively been telling people, these bonds are pretty much as good as government bonds. No problem. You buy them, no worries. And we have exported hundreds of billions of dollars of these. In fact, these have been among our most lucrative and biggest exports. So the Central Bank of China has hundreds of billions of dollars of these on their assets. So we can't just say to our biggest trading partners, our diplomatic rivals, you know, Henry Paulson would get tarred and feathered the next time he shows up at one of these conferences. We could not, literally, we could not let that happen.
But, you know, the problem is, though, this doesn't do anything about the reason that Fannie and Freddie went bankrupt, because of the huge losses. The houses are not worth anywhere near what people borrowed to buy them. So there's hundreds of billions of dollars of losses, probably in excess of $1 trillion worth of losses that are still there. But all the government has done is said, instead of the people who bought the mortgages suffering the losses, every American taxpayer, every American citizen is going to suffer those losses instead. Because there's either going to have to be massive tax hikes to pay for these defaults, or more likely, tremendous printing of money. We're going to have massive inflation. And if people think the cost of food and energy is high now, wait till they see how much things cost in a few years after all these mortgages fail.
Well, I hope Peter's wrong, if only because we live in the same neighborhood out in the suburbs. So if his house is going down 30%...
yeah, except I rent, so it doesn't matter to me.
He puts his money where his mouth is, I guess, huh?
But the larger issue is that, this will not stop housing prices from falling. But I think we may, it's unquantifiable what the cost will be to the taxpayer. The Fannie Mae and the default rates on those Fannie Mae mortgages are actually somewhat lower than the nation at large.
Well,
and so there is some hope that, if things kind of muddle along, that these losses will not be realized, and that the government will not necessarily have to make good on hundreds of billions of dollars.
Well, your point was right. The government is trying to maintain bubble home prices, but they can't do it. Home prices need to collapse, and the whole irony of this is, theoretically, Fannie and Freddie are there to make housing more affordable. But now their mission is to keep housing prices from falling. Well, that makes houses less affordable. The best way to solve this problem is to let housing prices collapse to the point where Americans can actually afford to buy them, and where lenders will lend. Because right now, nobody would lend because nobody could pay back the loan.
Is there an irony here that it's the Bush administration that's had to step in and do this, when it was the Bush administration 8 years ago that was saying, we need to get government out of the markets, we need to get government out of trade, we need to have free trade. The problem is
government never got out of the markets. We have this problem because of government interference. We had the government, the Federal Reserve, setting interest rates instead of the free market, so they set them too low, and we had the housing bubble, and we had Freddie and Fannie with this implied government guarantee that let people buy these mortgages even though people couldn't pay the mortgage.
One of the other ironies...
Paulson liked having to do this and didn't like to be in this position.
Well, he was CEO of Goldman Sachs, where he liked doing big deals and advising, and now he's really having a chance to do that without having to deal with too many of the consequences. One of the real ironies is that, the whole ownership society agenda, which Bush and his colleagues have been pushing, is that, people own assets, that's good for the economy. Well, one of the big places they focused on was home ownership. And,
the Democrats really pushed home ownership too.
Everybody pushed it, and they touted every month. The numbers came out. It's at a record rate. It was at 66%, then at the height of the bubble, 69%. They said, you know, African Americans have record high ownership rate. But when you buy something with no money down, as I think 45% of the purchases in 2007, that's not an ownership society. That's a debtorship or borrowership society.
And
now we're unwinding. So the home ownership rate is now back to where it was in 2001.
Right. We have to leave it there, gentlemen. We could talk about this over. I mean, this is fascinating stuff, and I think a lot of people need to realize that, you know, we talk about the bailout of Fannie and Freddie. It is your money. It is our money. And now we are the biggest the nation's biggest mortgage lender, I think, if we can safely say, since it is our money that's doing it.
We're co-signing every mortgage.
There we go. Peter Schiff, president of Euro Pacific Capital, and Dan Gross, senior editor at Newsweek. Thanks, guys. Thanks.